Welcome, everyone. We're tracking quite a few developments today across the globe.
Absolutely. From potential legal shifts here in the U.S., some complex diplomatic moves, ongoing conflicts, and even tech meeting culture.
Let's jump right in. First up, here at home. There's been talk about habeas corpus, specifically related to the previous administration. Stephen Miller mentioned it.
That's right. He indicated the Trump administration had considered suspending habeas corpus. And habeas corpus, for anyone needing a quick refresher, is that fundamental legal right.
The right to challenge your detention before a judge, basically.
Exactly. It's often called the Great Writ of Liberty, a cornerstone protection against, well, unlawful imprisonment.
And the Constitution is pretty specific about when it can be suspended, isn't it?
Very specific. Article 1 allows it only in cases of actual rebellion or invasion, and only when public safety genuinely requires it. It's a high bar.
Has it happened often?
Extremely rarely in U.S. history. You've got Lincoln during the Civil War, during Reconstruction targeting the KKK, then the Philippines back in 1905, and Hawaii after Pearl Harbor. Always tied to major national crises.
So why was this being considered now, or at least talked about by Miller? He linked it to immigration, correct?
Yes, Miller specifically brought up immigration. He invoked the Constitution's invasion clause, arguing that the situation at the border, mentioning the Trinidad Aragua gang specifically, qualifies as an invasion.
And this ties into their frustrations with courts blocking deportations.
It seems so. They faced numerous legal challenges, including habeas petitions from people facing deportation like Mahmoud Khalil and Rumeysa Öztürk. This invasion argument seems like a way they were exploring to bypass some of those court rulings, potentially using something like the old Alien Enemies Act, too.
But how have the courts actually viewed this invasion argument when it comes to migration?
Well, federal judges have pretty consistently rejected it in this context. You have judges appointed by Reagan, G.W. Bush, Obama, even Trump appointed Judge Gallagher.
A broad consensus, then.
It seems so. They've generally defined invasion in the constitutional sense as a military attack, an act of war, not migration flows. Judge Gallagher specifically questioned if unaccompanied minors seeking asylum could really be seen as that kind of threat.
And legal experts. What's their take on the limits here?
People like Steve Vladeck at Georgetown Law emphasize that the suspension clause is really narrow. It requires a genuine, specific national security emergency where court review itself would be dangerous.
So not just disagreement with policy outcomes.
Right. Vladeck argues that cases like Öztürk's, just challenging deportation, don't come close to meeting that constitutional threshold for suspending habeas corpus. It highlights that ongoing tension between executive desires and fundamental legal rights. And, it plays against the backdrop of the previous administration's frequent criticism of judges.
Okay, let's shift focus overseas. Diplomacy seems active regarding Ukraine. Putin's invited Kyiv for talks.
Yes, an invitation for direct talks, potentially in Istanbul, reported around May 15th. This came shortly after leaders from the UK, France, Germany, and Poland visited Kyiv.
And they were pushing for something specific.
They were. They jointly called for a 30-day ceasefire and warned Russia of new and massive sanctions on energy and banking if Moscow didn't agree. Interestingly, UK Prime Minister Starmer also suggested President Trump supported this immediate ceasefire demand.
How did the Kremlin react to that pressure and the invitation?
Cautiously. Spokesman Dmitry Peskov basically said pressure doesn't work, but they'd consider the proposal. Putin himself talked about a potential new truce, mentioning Istanbul as a possible venue, and a call with Turkey's Erdogan, but he didn't directly address the 30-day ceasefire demand itself.
Putin also seemed to suggest Ukraine's been the obstacle to past ceasefires.
He did. He listed several instances around energy infrastructure, Easter, WWII events where he claims Kyiv didn't respond positively to Russian proposals.
But Zelensky's view is different.
Very different. He's dismissed previous unilateral Russian ceasefires as just theatrical shows, not genuine efforts, and insists on a longer, more substantial truce. The last direct talks were way back in 2022, so any restart would be significant.
And President Trump's take on Putin's announcement.
He called it a potentially great day on Truth Social, suggesting it could be good for both Russia and Ukraine, and maybe the world. He also mentioned he's willing to keep working with both sides.
All right, moving over to South Asia. Tensions between India and Pakistan flared up, but now there's a ceasefire. Seems fragile, though.
Extremely fragile. It followed days of pretty intense cross-border military strikes, apparently the worst confrontation in decades. It seems to have started with a militant attack in Pahalgam, which triggered Indian retaliation across the line of control.
And the U.S. played a role in calming things down.
President Trump announced what he called a full and immediate ceasefire on Truth Social, crediting U.S. efforts. Pakistan's foreign minister confirmed an agreement was reached and, interestingly, mentioned the involvement of, quote, 36 countries. Trump praised both leaders for agreeing.
But then there were reports of immediate violations.
Yes, almost immediately. Explosions were reported in Indian-administered Kashmir just hours after the deal was announced. Both sides pointed fingers, accusing the other of breaking the ceasefire.
So India accused Pakistan.
Right. India's Foreign Secretary Missionary spoke of repeated violations and promised an appropriate response.
And Pakistan.
Pakistan maintained its commitment to the deal despite what it called Indian violations and urged restraint. It really underscores how deep the distrust runs, especially over Kashmir.
Despite the rocky start, both governments did publicly acknowledge the ceasefire later.
They did. India's External Affairs Minister Jaishankar confirmed an understanding on stoppage of firing while stressing their stance against terrorism. Pakistan's PM Shehbaz Sharif said it was reached for the benefit of everybody.
Any more details on the diplomacy involved? U.S. Secretary of State Rubio mentioned ongoing talks.
Yes, Rubio talked about discussions on a wider set of issues happening at a neutral site involving high-level people like U.S. VP J.D. Vance and the prime ministers. The UN Secretary General also welcomed the de-escalation.
So a lot happening behind the scenes, probably.
Seems that way. Experts point to quiet back channels and U.S. mediation, including Secretary Rubio calling Pakistan's army chief. The UK and Saudi Arabia were reportedly involved too. Given the history and the nuclear aspect, stabilizing the situation was obviously a huge priority.
Let's turn now to Gaza and the humanitarian situation there. The U.S. has confirmed a new plan for aid delivery bypassing the usual UN channels.
That's right. They're setting up a system using private companies to distribute aid. The stated reason is Israel's ongoing blockade and concerns that Hamas has been diverting aid delivered through existing channels.
How is this new system supposed to work?
U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee announced these distribution centers. They'll be secured by private security contractors, supposedly to ensure aid reaches civilians, not Hamas. He did clarify Israel isn't directly involved in the delivery, but will provide perimeter security.
And how has the UN reacted to this? They're usually central to aid operations.
They've reacted very strongly and negatively. UN agencies like OCHA see this as effectively weaponizing aid. They argue it undermines core humanitarian principles like neutrality and impartiality and creates an unnecessary parallel system.
Because the humanitarian situation is already critical.
Absolutely dire. The blockade means severe shortages of everything: food, medicine, fuel, shelter. Community kitchens, like World Central Kitchens, have had to shut down. Food prices are skyrocketing. It's a catastrophe.
What about the claim of Hamas diverting aid? That's been a point of contention.
It has. Israel and the U.S. maintain that concern. The UN agencies, however, argue they have strong monitoring systems and that large-scale diversion hasn't been the issue when sufficient aid is actually allowed in. They say looting has been minimal compared to the need.
So who is running this new private operation?
It seems to be a new group called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF. They claim they'll have an independent, rigorously audited model guided by humanitarian principles.
Any familiar names involved?
There are reports linking the former CEO of World Central Kitchen and possibly David Beasley, the former head of the World Food Program, to this GHF initiative. They plan to start with 4 sites for about 1.2 million people, hoping to expand.
The White House is pushing back against criticism that this is militarizing aid.
Yes, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt rejected that term. But this comes just as Israel's security cabinet reportedly approved intensifying its military offensive and potentially taking over aid distribution themselves, moves that drew widespread international condemnation.
Including from allies like the UK.
Yes. The UK expressed concern that Israel's reported plan might not align with humanitarian principles. The UN Security Council has also been briefed on this new US-backed plan, and an urgent meeting was requested.
What might this distribution actually look like on the ground?
Israeli media suggested hubs in a sterile zone in Rafah. Screened family reps would collect aid on foot, maybe around 70 kilograms per family per week. The stated goal is cutting off Hamas, but there are huge questions about whether this can work at scale compared to the established UN system with hundreds of distribution points.
And the UN has decided not to cooperate with this new system.
That's the decision after what they called careful analysis. UNICEF warned it could actually increase child suffering and maybe lead to forced displacement.
Is the planned volume of aid even sufficient?
The initial target, maybe 60 trucks a day, is significantly less than what aid groups say is needed and less than what got in during the last ceasefire. OCA's conclusion was stark. The proposals do not meet the minimum bar for principled humanitarian support.
This UN decision could have broader implications, couldn't it?
Potentially, yes, for their perceived neutrality and future operations in conflict zones worldwide. Meanwhile, tons of UN supplies are reportedly stuck near the border crossings. Access remains the key bottleneck, and the risk of famine is growing, especially in the north, where families are facing desperate shortages.
Okay, let's quickly touch on some other global developments. Port Sudan. It's been hit by attacks.
Yes, after being relatively safe, Port Sudan faced a week of aerial attacks blamed on the RSF. This reportedly destroyed fuel depots, which hit water pumps, causing water prices to surge. There are fuel shortages, power cuts, a really difficult situation for residents, and the many displaced people sheltering there.
And a major concern for aid delivery, too.
Definitely. Port Sudan is a crucial hub for humanitarian aid entering the country, so disrupting it is a serious problem.
Switching topics completely, AI and copyright. Artists are raising alarms.
Over 400 British artists and writers, big names like Elton John and Dua Lipa included, are calling on the UK government to update copyright law. They're worried their work is being used to train AI models without permission or compensation, essentially being given away to tech firms.
What are they asking for specifically?
They support an amendment to a data bill that would require transparency, forcing companies to disclose if they're using copyrighted material for AI training. The government's consulting, but creators are clearly anxious about protecting their livelihoods.
And then there's this unusual map dispute between Mexico and Google.
Yeah, this is quite something. Mexico is reportedly suing Google because, for U.S. users, Google Maps started showing the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America.
Following a U.S. government directive.
Yeah. Apparently following a U.S. House vote and a Trump executive order regarding the U.S. continental shelf, Mexico argues that order doesn't apply to the entire body of water, and Google ignored their request to keep the traditional name. Google says it's just following official U.S. government sources. It's quite a spat. And, you might recall, Trump previously floated renaming the Persian Gulf, too.
Wow. Okay, shifting to Africa, Botswana has a notably young new minister.
Yes, Lesego Chombo. She was Miss Botswana 2022 and Miss World Africa 2024. Now, at just 26, she's been appointed Minister of Youth and Gender after a recent landslide election.
That's quite a transition.
It is. It signals a strong focus from the new government on youth issues, gender equality, and trying to diversify the economy away from diamonds. She's tackling big issues like unemployment and gender-based violence right away.
From politics to space, a piece of old Soviet spacecraft came down.
It seems so. The European Space Agency reported that a fragment, likely the lander, from Cosmos 482 launched way back in '72 for Venus, but got stuck in Earth orbit, probably re-entered the atmosphere recently.
Any danger?
Unlikely. They don't know exactly where it came down, but chances are it was over ocean. Most of these things burn up anyway. It does highlight, though, the ongoing issue of space debris and the need for controlled re-entries for newer satellites.
And finally, a voice from the past commenting on the present, an Alcatraz inmate.
Charlie Hopkins, one of the last living former inmates of Alcatraz, shared some memories. This came up because former President Trump recently mentioned wanting to reopen the prison.
What did Hopkins recall?
He talked about how incredibly quiet it was, deathly quiet, and even an escape attempt he was involved in. But both he and experts agree reopening Alcatraz is basically unthinkable now it's crumbling and would cost a fortune.
So why suggest it?
Hopkins thinks it's more symbolic, Trump making a point about crime and immigration, using Alcatraz as a tough-on-crime symbol.
Lastly, the election of the first American Pope, Leo XIV, is causing some ripples.
Indeed. While many Catholics celebrate, some figures associated with the MAGA movement, like Steve Bannon, have voiced disappointment. They seem to see him as maybe not America first enough, pointing to past comments critical of Trump or alignment with Pope Francis on issues like immigration.
So potential friction ahead between the Vatican and the administration.
There's speculation about that, yes. Surveys show U.S. Catholics themselves have varied views, of course. The new Pope's background and even some past social media activity are being scrutinized for clues about his potential approach.
So looking back at everything we've covered today, it's really a snapshot of a world grappling with complex issues on multiple fronts.
It really is. You see these potential shifts in long-held legal rights, the very difficult high-stakes diplomacy needed in conflict zones, the immense challenge of just getting basic aid to people in places like Gaza. It all feels very interconnected.
And then you have these newer challenges, like AI impacting creative work, alongside political shifts, even debates over names on a map, or the implications of a new religious leader.
Exactly. It all points to this constant negotiation of power, of rights, of identity playing out globally. As you listen, what stands out most to you? What questions linger about how these events might shape the days and weeks ahead? Something to consider as we wrap up today.